There has been a very weird trend in the past few years that I can't really wrap my head around, which is that increasingly I see people disagreeing with each other and even perceiving each other as enemies who otherwise are ideologically very aligned and share very, very similar values. If you were to stop them and ask them about individual values, foundational values like the value of democracy, the value of human rights, of freedom of expression, of equality, the ability to develop, yada, 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 they would basically share the same foundational principles. They would come from a very, very similar worldview where they would insist that you have to recognize all people as equal. You have to help all people to develop their human potential. You have to provide them with the basic means to get along through life and have a similar starting point from which to build a life. So if you ask them about all of these foundational questions, they will easily all score as coming from the same world space. I'm really talking about people who come basically from the same tradition of thought of modernism and postmodernism. Significantly different from people who stem from a rather traditionalist way of approaching reality, where you have higher authority that reveals itself through scripture and where moral law is basically dictated. It's not something that is found by intuition or by reasoning, but it's something that is revealed to you through scripture. That is a very, very different way of approaching matters of life and matters of importance. And yet those people that I just described to be perfectly aligned when it comes to the major values and even temperamentally, because worldviews usually come with a certain form of temperament and emphasis on which experiences and which attitudes to cultivate. Even temperamentally, those people are very similar. For example, they are much more agreeable. They are much more willing to listen to the other side. They are much more willing to take in different points of view. They're much more open to the idea of pluralism, of different ideas coming together. They are much more aversive against groupthink and collectivist movements and tend to stay away from those. They have much more aversion towards strong leader figures and find that disgusting, have an issue with that. All of those are shared attitudes that come from the same world space of people who should actually be able to get along. I mean, there's basically no world in which you could be more similar to someone than a world in which you share those foundational values. If you find people who share those values with you, you're basically meeting yourself. It's kind of boring because that's not diversity. That's like secularism that is all pervasive. And this form of secularism is a very standard position for many young people, the younger generations in general, and has been the starting point for quite a while now, without us openly admitting it. But at the end of the day, the moment you accept the division of powers, you're secular in attitude, because you accept that whatever you personally, an individual might be believing in, the way we do social order is not through revelation, but through positive law. It is conventional agreements that we now make with each other, taking each other into account, treating each other as equals, and dialogically getting to somewhere where we can live in a world that we can all agree to. You know, the Rawlsian wheel of ignorance, where you could basically agree to entering this kind of world before being born and not knowing which party you would be born into. You could then agree to being born into this world. This is an intuition that I think many of the younger generation share. And yet I see incredible divisions. And yet I see people being divided, particularly around political issues, to the degree that they perceive each other not only as having different opinions, but as enemies who would literally go to war with each other. They perceive the other side. And this is really interesting to observe. When you ask the question, well, how does it come to these differences? How does it come? And the example with Palestine and Israel, I think, is the prime example. You can use Ukraine and Russia as well as conflicts that are more relevant in Europe today, or relevant for the Western world, to put it. These conflicts are highly divisive, and you can't really figure out the pattern where people will land on these issues. Well, in the past, it was possible to make predictions, like, for example, when you know what somebody believes about abortion, you kind of have a sense for what they think about gun rights. So there was like something like a family resemblance, where you could actually place someone within a worldview. Knowing certain positions, you could actually extrapolate other positions that don't seem to be directly related to each other. This is really weird. But as George Lakoff has suggested, maybe the kind of relation is happening on a much, much more foundational level of what kind of frames you use to interpret reality. So what Lakoff has understood is suggesting is that since we experience reality through very, very foundational and basic metaphors, the choice of those metaphors actually matters in how you perceive everything, and it colors everything that you perceive individually. Those metaphors are, for example, he gives the example that conservatives, for example, rather see the state in terms of the strict father figure. So the model of the strict father, and the father can be punishing. The father does not unconditionally love you, but expect something back. So you have to prove yourself. Achievement is important. You have to earn your love, and you have to earn your position in life. Yada, yada, yada. Well, liberals, on the other hand, emphasize the state in terms of the unconditionally loving mother. So the state is there to give, to unconditionally love you, no matter how bad you fuck up, and so on. So the idea here is that since we emphasize different foundational metaphors, those color everything else that we perceive and kind of predetermine what position you will take on gun rights and what position you will take on abortion. So even though those two issues seem totally unrelated to each other, they are related through the basic metaphors through which you perceive reality. And then he spans out, like, what are the foundational metaphors for different world spaces or for different worldviews. The funny thing is, you can't do that in the present day situation. You can't predict where somebody will land looking at their, if you want, worldview and looking at their foundational metaphors. They might be progressive in their thinking, they might be liberal in their thinking, and might end up in a very, very different spot from you on the spectrum. And this is really weird. For example, we're in a weird situation where somebody who is pro-Ukraine might be supporting Israel. And just as a side note, most Ukrainians actually support Israel in the current conflict, and not Palestinians. It's a weird situation. How do you explain that people can fall on so different positions and perceive each other, despite otherwise agreeing on basically all the important issues in life, perceive each other as enemies? And then when you ask the question, well, why does the other side disagree with me? The explanations are usually extremely disappointing and unconvincing. What usually comes as an answer for why other people who otherwise share your values disagree with you, the answer usually is, well, the first thing is they are uninformed. They just don't know the conflict. They have not read enough about it. Well, as if there were no intelligent people on the other side. As if there were no people on the other side who know much more than you do on the issue and could give for every argument that you make 10 other arguments supporting their position. So it's obviously not information alone. Then they claim there is something like a tribal commitment, right? Once you belong to a tribe, obviously you will navigate the world in a different way. But that's also not very convincing, because we live in the least tribal times ever. People are as individualistic as you can get. And particularly in the liberal and progressive circles, people tend to be hyper individuals. They tend to know everything better on every issue and everything differently. People are priding themselves of coming up with different positions than the majority on everything. It is a trend almost in progressivism that no matter what the trending position, you have to come up with something that's entirely different. I think this was one of the reasons why progressives went so strongly into mysticism. Kind of a lucky guess, I guess. But it was not because there was so much wisdom and insight behind it, but it's just not the thing that everybody else does. It's just something that's super weird, a minority thing, and I'm doing my individual path, right? I'm not going the path of the broader community. This doesn't explain it either. Tribalism doesn't explain the people landing on different points either. And the worrying part is that we don't have really good explanations for why we disagree in the first place and why we come to perceive each other literally as enemies. I mean, the terminology that is being used here. When you ask people, well, why do you think the other side is disagreeing with you? The terminology is really, really shocking. People are saying the other side has closed their hearts. In other words, they're not feeling. The other side is blind to the facts. In other words, they're not thinking. The other side is closed in groupthink. They're like a crowd of people. They're not individuals. You notice all of those explanations are deeply concerning, because what they're saying is that the other side is not human. Oh, and by the way, the other side is just crazy. They've gone nuts. If you say about somebody that they don't feel, they don't have their heart open, they don't think, they are tribal, they are crowd, and they are crazy or outright incomprehensible, you've basically said to someone that they're an animal. You've basically told them they're not human. This is really, really worrying. If this is your explanation for why people disagree on these issues foundationally, people who are otherwise decently intelligent, who are otherwise decently informed, and you can find people on both sides on any of those issues who are decently intelligent and who know much more than the average person does, who have spent professionally their entire lives studying these conflicts, and yet they end up on different sides. If you can find people like that, it can't be the explanation that people are just stupid, uninformed, or behaving like animals. And that's really, really troubling. Now, my speculation for why this is happening and what is actually happening in detail, my speculation is that it has to do with how we are making sense of reality in general. It has to do with narrative warfare that is being used on social media, basically having hacked our cognitive apparatus of how we make sense of reality. And one of the features with which we seem to approach reality is that we as human beings seem not to be able of what Wilber has been calling integral thought, which is we are really not good at systemic thinking across many, many different domains. We're really not good at coordinating different ways of knowing with each other at the same time and learning from all of them at once. We are much better at situational coping. So when you're in a specific situation, you have to make a decision. The information that you get is very, very limited. And it often boils down to very, very simple intuitions that you have about how to do something properly in a given situation. And situationally, this works. This really gets us out of trouble in most situations. For example, when you're walking in the street, I'm just thinking of something random, you have a basic sense for what keeps you safe while you're walking on the street. And you don't have to read Descartes for that. You don't have to start studying the Bible. You don't have to, oh, I don't know, I wouldn't know where to start thinking about the issue of how not to die while walking in the street. No, you have a very, very good sense for what are the relevant things to watch out for, right? You use your peripheral vision, for example, to orient yourself and watch out for dangers. And you don't start thinking about the meaning of life, because this wouldn't help you in this given situation. So you don't need to cross-reference your knowledge from one domain with another domain. It's just something that's punctual, something that you can immediately apply. But when it gets to conflicts that are multidimensional, conflicts that have many aspects to them, when you look at all of those conflicts, they have everything in them. They have human history in them. They have economy in them, economical interests. They have subjectivities in them. They have people who are significantly different from each other. They have human history in them. Different people who have different histories, who have different self-identities, self-interpretations of who they are, who they want to be, and who they think the other side is. If you look at those conflicts, I think Wilber called those nasty questions. They are nasty questions because they involve pretty much all domains of knowledge that you can have available. They encompass in one. You have to know about everything to get a sense for where you actually are. You have to have a sense for the culture in which you are in, because it matters. If you change the culture, you would change the nature of the entire conflict. Once you have changed the culture, the conflict might even disappear. So culture as culture is already relevant. If you change the economic situation in all of those conflicts that I just mentioned, again, the conflicts will develop in an entirely different fashion. If you change the leadership, and leadership is very important when it comes to social organization, again, the conflicts will develop in entirely different directions, because personal decisions of the leadership, personal attitudes and personal beliefs of the leadership matter. All of those domains matter at once. But to grasp all of this requires that you can cross-correlate, triangulate between all of those perspectives at once and figure out what is relevant to keep in mind in a given situation, what is relevant to know, and what is irrelevant. This is something we human beings are incapable of. Just to give you another example, when you look at religion, it is very difficult for human beings to deal with religion because we approach it as a punctual phenomenon, as if we're walking on the street and having to figure out how to not die. So you're not looking at different dimensions, you're just looking at the major aspects for which to approach it. So when you look at religion, of course, you will say, I'll look at the text and I'll look at how it can be interpreted and how it has been interpreted in the past. But this is not how you can approach in religion. If you want to get a sense for what to make with religion, you have to actually look at modern day psychology. You have to look at what did we learn through modern day psychology about how human beings deal with personal challenges, how personal development actually occurs, and then look at the scripture again. You have to have in mind specific notions about, for example, the sense of superiority. And everybody who studies psychology knows about that. It knows about the phase of children where they feel like they're beyond everybody else. When you look at religious scripture, you will find aspects of that which you wouldn't see unless you had looked at psychological phenomena. Same thing with sociology. If you look at sociology and how groups are steered, how social cohesion is actually created, and then look back into a religious scripture, you will read an entirely different religious scripture, because you will have the background knowledge of how social communities and how social entities are formed in the first place. And we human beings seem to be incapable of doing that. We're trying to approach all of these phenomena by looking at them, again, as if you're walking on the street and just minding your own business, and you're not caring about all the kinds of disciplines that could possibly be related. But with these complex challenges, all of those disciplines, all of those dimensions of being human are involved. And what seems to happen to me, and this is the crux where I believe the disagreements are actually coming from, is that we choose a few of those domains with which we already have a familiarity, with which we have some experience, and then apply those to the phenomenon at hand. So, for example, if you are somebody who has been raised progressive. You have been raised in a very specific context where you most likely didn't have to fight a war. You most likely never faced people who didn't like you. Now, I might be exaggerating, but you get the point. When you've been raised progressive, you're usually raised in an environment in which you get almost unconditional love from your environment, and in which you don't have to fight for your life. You don't have to face real embodied danger, and in which one of the highest values is self-reflectivity and self-questioning, and constantly redefining yourself, constantly reinventing yourself, and finding your own path, finding your own calling. So you are coming from a domain of experience which is mostly shaped by those very primary relationships that you have with the people around you, and those very primary challenges that you face with the people around you. And what elevates you socially in this context is when you're self-critical, when you can reflect yourself, when you can dialogically engage with other people, when you can show understanding, tolerance for other people, yada, yada, yada. There are many values that actually help you raise your social status within that context. And what you then learn is that the major things which matter in this context to get along with other people is mutual understanding, is listening to each other, stepping back, giving, showing the other cheek, and so on. And this works within this social context. Once you are in this social frame, you then, of course, use your knowledge and your experience to analyze other phenomena. And then obviously, when you look at the Ukraine-Russia conflict or the Palestine-Israel conflict, obviously you will use those domains to analyze the phenomenon and look at it. And then, of course, you will see the suffering. You will see how people are not listening to each other, how one side is stronger than the other side and abusing its power, how one side is causing immense suffering, and so forth. When, on the other hand, and this is something that I have to experience the hard way, because I tend to be this kind of person, right, who has been raised progressive in their thinking. I moved to Bulgaria, which is a much more conservative context. At a similar time, a friend of mine who also was pretty progressive in his thinking moved to Bulgaria. And he faced a very specific challenge. He had a neighbor who was difficult to deal with, who was like very typical for Bulgaria, not someone you can talk to, but you have to bully yourself into the position of power and dominance. And what my friend tried to do was actually talk to that person and to reason with that person. Well, he got shot in the face. He got shot dead. Actually, that's the reality of it. And this was a very sad incident, which is I think, it is very representative of the experience that you might have when you move as a progressive person to the Balkans, because you figure out that all the things that helped you make it in a different social context, that were valuable in a different social context, all those things make you weak in a different social context, like the Balkans. Because in the Balkans, for example, if you listen or if you step back and give in, you are perceived as weak, and people will become even more aggressive with you because they will feel that they can use you, they will feel that they can trample on you, and that you're just somebody they can rid themselves of easily. You find that all the strengths that you thought you had, like self-reflexivity, actually hold you back, and you need entirely different qualities when you want to survive in this sphere. And I believe this is what's happening when you have people who have, for example, dealt with fundamentalism in life. And I'm not talking about the nice kind of fundamentalists, because I know really, really lovely fundamentalists. They believe really weird stuff, I'm really sorry to say. But at the same time, they're the most lovely people you could ever imagine. And they're the kindest people, and I would definitely trust my children to them. Like, that's absolutely highest levels of trust that I could have to another person. But when you're dealing with somebody who's a fundamentalist, in the sense of the kind of fanaticism that hates somebody else, how do you deal with that as a progressive? Progressivism never faces this challenge in the first place, so I wouldn't even know how to approach this, and I myself could not deal with the nice kind of fundamentalism at all. I haven't changed a single opinion of fundamentalist friends of mine who are, again, the nice kind of fundamentalists. But then imagine facing somebody who is not a nice fundamentalist and radically hates you and thinks you are subhuman. How do you deal with that reality? Well, coming from that perspective, of course, then you will look at the conflict and judge it in a very different way. Of course, you will then look at what are the strategies that helped you make it in your social context. You will filter those out in the given context. And you will, for example, raise a question, well, how do you deal with fundamentalism otherwise, other than by using force, for example? This is the position that you will take. And this is the general, I think, pattern that seems to emerge. It's not that people disagree about the basic values, but that people are approaching the situation mostly from different experiential spheres. And it's very telling to me, for example, that the synchrony that appears, so that you can predict which side on the issue will be taken from people, is not so much whether they're conservative or whether they're liberal. So you can't make those predictions based on, foundational framing theory and yada, yada, yada. But much more, what kind of specific challenges have you had to deal with in your life? My observation has been that people who have been raised in an environment where they have to struggle with existential survival, and the kind of situation where, like here in the Balkans, where you really have to learn strategies to figure out ways of surviving that are not very dialogical. In many cases, they are power related. Most people who have gone through those experiences tend to weigh one side and tend to insist that if you want to have human rights and if you want to have justice, very much like on the Balkans, you can't just protest for it. It doesn't achieve anything. If you look at the Balkans are still a mess. You don't get anywhere by being nice. You don't get anywhere by just simply protesting. But you have to organize socially. You have to show social strength. And in the worst case, whether you like it or not, and I think the Ukrainians are showing that, you have to fight a war. That's something that's unimaginable to me or other progressives, I believe, because we can't even ponder the idea of fighting a war or dying for one side. This is something that is entirely foreign to the progressive mindset. And I'm aware it's something that we are lacking and something that, an ability that we simply don't have, but it's simply not a reality we've been raised in. So it's not a surprise we're not good at that. We're good at other things. But this is the only way I can really make sense of this. Of course, you can combine it with people not having paid attention to the conflict and not knowing enough about it. And of course, having tribal affiliations. This is trivial stuff, but the much, much deeper stuff, I believe, is that many of these differences are much more driven by the personal context of where you have been raised, the social context in which you've been raised, the social sphere that you have gone through, and your ability to coordinate these schemas that you use to make sense of reality with each other. And what we all fail at is the ability to cross-dimensionally coordinate different schemas to understand these conflicts in their complexity. And I think we're simply not built for that. And the only thing I see we can do at this point is see that limitation. Understand that limitation. Of course, everybody will be unhappy with that because people insist that you have to pick the right side, because otherwise you will be on the wrong side of history and you will have supported, the worst atrocities that are thinkable. But I think the solution does not lie in picking the right side. Whether we like it or not, I think the proper way of approaching this is not taking the right side, but seeing where these disagreements come from in the first place, and seeing ourselves, because what arises from that attitude is an understanding for how people can have a different position on those issues. And we won't solve the conflict by taking a side anyway. Just because we think that, if you're just on the right side of history and you've believed the right things at the right time, that the suffering will be ended and that one side will step away, that Israel just will step away and give itself up, its own identity. This won't happen. Israel is there to stay. And the same thing with Palestinians. Palestinians won't just disappear. They are there to stay, and it won't make a difference to the conflict whether you side with the one side or the other side. But it will make a difference to the conflict whether we are able to see why we disagree and when we are able to actually talk about that. And what I've seen is that we've totally lost the ability to even speak to the other side about this issue, because we perceive that even speaking, even the possibility of somebody moving us to the other side, or just even the possibility of someone not being on our side, is already something that is taboo, something that is unacceptable, because we are already so much in the tribal and narrative war mindset. And once we're in that, I mean, it's very, very clear. There is nothing to talk about. The only thing that remains to be done is to fight. And if this is what people want, if these are the consequences that people are willing to live with, then be it. But just be aware what path you have chosen.